Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yis completed his annual New Year's trip to Africa on Monday. Now in its 30th year, why does China prioritize African ties? And the U.S.'s European allies remain dedicated to maintaining the Iran nuclear deal after the U.S. withdrew. Can they maintain ties with the U.S. and keep the deal alive? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yis wrapped up his week-long trip to Africa on Monday. He visited Egypt, Djibouti, Eritrea, Burundi and Zimbabwe. 2020 also marks the 30th consecutive year since 1991 that a Chinese foreign minister has visited Africa at the beginning of the year. Now, over the past 2 decades, China's trade with Africa has grown 20-fold to reach more than $200 billion in 2019. And China has been Africa's largest trading partner for 11 consecutive years, and 44 African countries and the African Union Commission have established cooperation with China under the Belt and Road Initiative. So why is this annual New Year's trip so important for China's African relationship? I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Professor Wang Yiwei from Renmin University of China and Wanjie Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, a consultancy company. Welcome to The Point. It's good to have you here. Before we get down to the discussion, let's first hear what the Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister said about the reasons why the Chinese Foreign Ministry chose Africa for their first overseas trip for the past 30 years. He said, first of all, this is based on the special feelings of friendship from generation to generation and sharing weal and woe between China and Africa. Second, it is based on the realistic needs of deepening cooperation and common development between China and Africa. Third, it is based on the important mission of strengthening international cooperation and safeguarding common interests between China and Africa. So, 30 years in a row is quite tradition to keep up, right? Hannah, how do you look at it? How important is that trip from the African perspective?
Sure, well, it's certainly a great, it helps China to engage with the African continent. It's pretty difficult. Of course, there's 55 African countries to get around, which is not very easy. But if you add up, certainly over the last 10 years, that means with this trip, the Chinese leadership has been able to visit over 70 African countries, make over 70 trips to over 30 of the African countries, which means that they're able to get to know the leaders and to engage with them and find out what they really need. And it means that, of course, the political relationship between China and Africa has certainly been able to improve considerably over the time. 1991 is a start, and then 2000, of course, the China-Africa Forum and Cooperation began, and it's been continuing, and there was a huge meeting in 2018 on that. So this is, it's definitely helped that relationship build. The question is, has it built the economic ties, and that's what I hope we can
We're going to talk about that
later.
we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But still, 30 years, it's quite something, right, to maintain. I mean, I don't know whether when the leaders started, when the first, back then, the Chinese foreign minister back then, when he started these trips, did he had in his mind that he was going to continue, or this tradition was going to form? Professor Wang, exactly what happened? How do you think this 40 years became such a tradition?
Well, Africa is a land of opportunities because now the similar population, 1.3 billion, will catch up with China very soon. Very young, dynamic. The working age, 27. China is 47 now. India, 37. So the many labor-intensive industrial, no hope in China. It's huge space. For instance, in Nigeria.
But 30 years ago, did the Chinese foreign minister back then had that vision that he was going to set foot, that China is going to stay in Africa and continue to make their presence?
Of course, firstly, political foundations support each other, anti-colonialism movement and independence, and Africans help China resume the United Nations seat, and also we appreciate that. China also helped Africa a lot in Tanzania, Zambia, the railway, and also future. Because of the American first and also Brexit, Africans, many countries still rely on the foreign aid. So now cut, not just from UK, also from European Union twice. So now they suffered a lot of the recessions of the global economy. So China definitely is the hope. In the past 40 years, China's modernization, this experience we can share with the African countries. 40 years ago, our per capita GDP is only 1/3, even less, of South Sahara Africans' average. But now China live the poverty, all this experience we can share, and China's industrialization experience very fresh.
Of course. But I think it's quite a foresight right back then for China to think about the importance of Africa and really deepen its engagement 30 years. And it's also been almost exactly the time that China deepened its reform and opened up to the outside world. Let's talk about this trip, though. 5 countries, as I mentioned: Egypt, Djibouti, Eritrea, Burundi, and Zimbabwe. Why these countries, Wanjie?
Well, it's very difficult to tell. We've got very different types of countries, and also both in terms of their economic situation, their poverty situation. Egypt being one of the largest economies on the continent, and then Eritrea and Burundi, some of the smallest, even smallest populations. So really, the Foreign Minister Wang Yis has gone to. It's very unclear exactly how these countries have been picked, and I think probably one could do an exercise of what exactly is coming up.
Right.
We know that Eritrea, for example, hasn't yet signed the Belt and Road Initiative, so that might be something that's on the agenda to discuss.
Professor Wang, could you shed light on the choice of these countries? It must not have been a random choice.
Of course.
Or was it?
Mr. Wang Yi visited many other African countries in the past years. So these 5 countries actually particularly want to highlight the cooperations on the projects like Djibouti, their free trade economic zone, I think quite successful, and also the railway connected to the Ethiopia and now Eritrea.
Ethiopia, you mean?
Yes,
Ethiopia?
they built the rail connect each other, and also stop in your country, Kenya, just to visit the stand of the rail, and now wants to extend to maybe in the future, I think to Burundi. Now I think.
Yeah, but is that why he visited these countries, Djibouti or Burundi?
But we'll talk about the future cooperation, definitely. Of course, some countries, they have the routine pageantry with the China-African Forum. They want to make the forum's achievements be carried out of that. Also, political relations, I think.
All right, let's take a look at what one of our friends on Twitter had for us. When I forecast this discussion, we sent out a tweet, and he replied. He said, by the way, by this Twitter user called PanSB, he said, the West has abandoned Africa. Wanjie, what's your reaction? Do you think it is true?
I don't think so, actually. I think more and more countries are realizing that Africa is a very, very important continent to engage with, and thinking about how to do that in as successful a way as China has so far. Next week is going to be the UK-Africa Summit, Investment Summit, held in London. We'll see several African presidents and leaders go over there. Malta just announced a new Africa strategy. So a country as small as Malta. So we are seeing a number of countries thinking we really do need to re-engage, in a sense, with African countries, and especially because of these points that Professor Wang mentioned around the dynamic youth population engaging with a continent which does have the largest numbers of poor people now in the world. So if we're going to be driving poverty reduction, we're going to be driving sustainable development, Africa's the first place to begin.
Well, tell us a little bit the on-the-ground stories. For instance, over the last year, China, of course, has been pushing forward its partnership with African counterparts. What are some of the real everyday stories and people that you have heard or met that you want to share with us here to highlight the kind of growing ties, maybe growing pains as well in this relationship? Professor Wang.
In the past 6 years, because I visited 16 times of Africa, more than 11 African countries, I found that the 3 major Chinese brands are now very popular: technical cell phone, the Huawei, and also StarTimes. The many movies, dramas from China. So African youth, particularly you mentioned about, they're very excited about China, what happened in China. They want to visit China and travel and even start in China. And also many Chinese tourists, now more than 1 million Chinese works there, more than 10,000 Chinese companies in Africa. Mm-hmm. So Africa definitely will be the future destination of Chinese tourists, and also now there are lots of the investment. I think when I visited Nigeria, for instance, recently, Nigeria, 60 years ago, they told me they began the industrialization process. But today, their industrialization is the same as that 60 years ago, less than 10%. But China, most successful story of their industrialization. Right. So I want to share the China experience of that.
Okay.
And then I also visit.
Before you move on, I want to hear the
African. Big trouble.
Yeah, I want to hear the African side of the story. How are Africans feeling about Chinese engaging with the Chinese? I understand in terms of the number of people learning Chinese, for instance, there's a huge interest, right? There's a lot of a great increase of the number of people learning Chinese. So over the past year, what is the most interesting experience that you had?
Look, I think it's not possible to give an overall African view, first of all. And in different countries as well, they have very different relationships with China. So I visited Rwanda, South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya last year, and for different projects. And in Kenya, for example, citizens are really interested in China in the sense of they want to trade more with China, and we've had a number of interesting agreements last year, for example, to be exporting avocados to China. But now is the year to make that real. The agreement happened last year. They want to see the results this year and really kind of push that. And then similarly with a country like Rwanda, China's engaged on numbers of infrastructure projects. As you walk around the roads in Rwanda, they're all constructed by Chinese companies. Yeah. And people know that, but they're also looking for even more from China, not just the products. They also want to be. When I say to them that those techno phones are actually manufactured, it's a Chinese company, but they're manufactured in Ethiopia. My Kenyan family are extremely surprised by that.
Now the slogan said, "Made in Africa with China."
That's right. So but there is this impression that everything is made in China, and this is something which I hope China will start to find a way to work with leaders to change the. Of course, China is Africa's biggest trade partner, but the majority of that is trade coming into African countries.
Well, so China has been holding these Import Expo, and a lot of African companies have been very active. Actually, personally,
we were too.
Yeah, personally, I met many African friends, and they were very excited about it. So I hope the momentum can be kept, and that people can really see the difference in their earnings, in their employment situation, in the local economic development in Africa because of these exchanges. Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Professor Wang Yiwei from the Renmin University of China, and Wanjie, Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined.